Hello, and welcome to The Human Climate. I'm Carol Smaldino. Today, my guest is Tony Gaskew. So welcome before I say anything else. I'm glad to have you. So Tony Gaskew is professor of criminal justice and Africana studies at the University of Pittsburgh, Bradford. He is a critical race theorist and teaches critical race theory and more at the University of Pittsburgh, Bradford. He is currently professor of criminal justice and Africana studies, director of the criminal justice program, and founding director of the prison education program at the University of Pittsburgh, Bradford. He has worked in policing and prison reentry. His most current book is Stop Trying to Fix Policing, Lessons Learned from the Front Lines of Black Liberation. And that's 2021. And his other book, which I've been able to go through, is Rethinking Prison Reentry. And that's from 2014. So welcome.
It's great to be here, Carol.
I'm going to say this from the beginning. I do want to focus a little bit on white liberals, and I consider myself one of them. So I don't really want to be bashing them, us. I don't want to be bashing them since I'm one of them. But there's a lot to be critical of. So we'll get there. I started with somehow I have a lot of James Baldwin in my house, so sometimes I just pick up things and find amazing things written. So I wanted to start with a quote. He says, in The American Inheritance, there is no suggestion of morality. The American inheritance is essentially an inheritance which is called opportunity. And in execution of this opportunity, it doesn't matter what principle of what human being is in the way, which probably makes sense to you. I do want to get to Palestinians and Israel, but all right, I'll take my time. I'm going to start with your father and how he helped you get from humiliation to humility. In Rethinking Prison Reentry, you talk about that a lot. You quote Evelyn Lindner, who in a sense brought us together in her work on humiliation, and she calls it the individually or institutionally enforced lowering of any person or group by a process of subjugation that damages or in many cases strips away pride, honor, and human dignity. And then you go on to say, without self-worth, self-pride, and self-respect, dignity becomes impossible to realize, not only for the individual, but the community as a whole. Shame, pain, suffering, anger, and violence become the universal language of those who have been humiliated, creating and maintaining a perpetual cycle of victimization. So I kind of wanted to ask you about your father here and about what you mean about getting from humiliation to humility.
Well, Carol, I was very fortunate where I grew up in the Black Power movement. The Black diaspora that had to suffer through enslavement, the Black codes, Jim Crow. And as I was born in the twilight of the 60s, my father introduced me into the Black Power movement because that's what he was part of. And I never had to face the level of humiliation that he had to as a child growing up in Jim Crow. So I was simply overwhelmed with this sense of what Blackness means. And the Aboriginal people on the planet is how I was introduced. And of course, because my father was involved in the Black Power movement, I was able to navigate my identity in a way that sometimes the generation that you see today simply cannot do. That is, I saw, witnessed the Black diaspora fighting back. And I don't think there's anything more beautiful to witness than a people fighting back for their liberation.
Yeah. Again, James Baldwin, he was, in 1949, he was reviewing a book by John Hope Franklin called From Slavery to Freedom. In the review, he was talking about the shattering occurrence of Black people trying to become more American. So you didn't have that.
Oh, and James Baldwin also talked about that at some point, every single person in America has to face a collision. That is what they think they're going to be and what America tells them they're going to be. It's going to be a head-on collision, and those that are able to survive that collision, specifically within the Black diaspora, will set the footprints for everyone else. And again, Baldwin had such of a mystical insight into the window of Black America. He was able to sort of shape it in a fashion, because what a lot of people sort of forget is that James Baldwin and Malcolm X, Malik Mahat were friends. And at some point, it's hard to sort of fathom that a Black male who was, in our perspective today, part of the LGBTQ plus community, was extremely close to a Muslim, where sexual orientation it's looked at in an extremely conservative fashion, that both of them saw the same vision of Black liberation in America.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking of the movie, I Am Not Your Negro, and so that's part of it. Yeah, so that is interesting. He keeps coming up because his words are still, I mean, so powerful, so meaningful.
And Carol, sometimes, again, with James Baldwin, for some people, he presents this very Eurocentric, civilized version of themselves, that when they see James Baldwin, they're not afraid. And so they sort of embrace his words. But I think it's the same sort of cloud that people fall under when it comes to Martin Luther King Jr. That again, specifically, liberals embrace Martin Luther King Jr. because they look at him as this pacifist, which incredibly he was not. That he was extremely radical, that James Baldwin was extremely radical, but liberals love to embrace one side of them because it allowed them to sort of accept the fact that they weren't the enemy, that James Baldwin couldn't be talking about me. There's no way that James Baldwin or Martin Luther King Jr. were speaking about me, when in fact they were directing their criticisms directly towards liberals in America. Let's
get to that. I mean, because that's the elephant here. You say in Stop Trying to Fix Policing, white liberals seek to validate systemic white superiority and Black inferiority. For critical race scholars like myself, it's disgustingly laughable that white liberalism is being used as the framework for solving white supremacy and America's racial problems in policing. White liberals benefit from white supremacy blindness. So, could you explicate a little?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of self-explanatory.
Yeah.
In America's 400-year history, there hasn't been one single moment where a liberal has not benefited from anti-Black violence. Not one. So if you benefit from it, then clearly you're able to exploit it. And in that specific quote, it related directly to the institution of policing, that policing and its anti-Black violence could not exist today if white liberals didn't support and love the police. And the idea is it becomes a moral question. Do you love your privilege of whiteness more than you love the safety of someone that doesn't look like you? And the 400-year history of America has shown time and time again that white liberals choose their own privilege other than the safety of Black people in America. You don't think the New York City Police Department has an $8 billion budget because of Black people, do you? And there's clearly not enough, white pro-police, far-right people that support the police. If it were not for the assistance of white liberals, you wouldn't see some of the issues that we're having today, specifically some of the anti-Black violent issues.
Could we talk a second about Black Lives Matter? I live in I live in a really white place. And so for me, I'm Jewish, which I think you know, but I feel something about there being so few Jews here and so many evangelical churches. But the truth is there are like almost no Black people, and like really almost no. And so I wonder, I have to tell you, it's been late in my years that I started to think, wait a minute. If there are no Black people here, what have people been doing to have that happen? Because there's no reason that Black people wouldn't be here. It's a pretty town. It's a university town. And so what do you make of that? Or can you say anything that can be helpful about how we all collude? And what would it look like if we didn't?
Yeah, I think in some aspects, Carol, you answer your own question. So if the area that you live in is predominantly liberals and there are no Black people that live there, then who's keeping the Black people out? I mean, you're answering your own question. So who's keeping them out?
So
it's not, and again, it's not these mythical far-right Trump supporters that are keeping them out, because they're not living there. So, and again, I think some of this conversation is almost common sense. I mean, unless the scholarly argument is going to be that the Black diaspora keeps itself out of these areas. And again, that would go against 400 years of history within the United States. I mean, and again, research has supported this thesis time and time and time again, and I'm sure you're familiar with the term, redlining. Do you think that specifically when it comes to how neighborhoods are configured, that that Black people place themselves in poverty. It the social construct doesn't work in that fashion. But again, Carol, I think you answer your own question. If Black people aren't keeping themselves out of the neighborhood, then who's keeping them out of the neighborhood?
So, this is also probably self-evident. To not keep Black people out of the neighborhood, we would have to be invested in that, in finding out how that happens, and in changing our comfort zone. Our comfort zoning. It's kind of, I think, a good expression I'm just making up. But our comfort zoning is that I guess we keep Black people out. So I actually had a conversation with my dentist, who was a Division I athlete in the University, Colorado State University. And this was maybe 2 years ago, but I was surprised, and I shouldn't be surprised because, again, it should be obvious, that it was hard to get Black athletes to want to come here because of the same reason, because there are so few Black people in the town, that they didn't want to be the only ones.
Yeah, and again, probably the more important point is, Carol, now that you know that, what are you going to do about it? And see, this is where, again, this lax comes in, where you know that oppression is taking place, but you're more comfortable in your own privilege than to do something about it. And again, this is an evolving cycle. So the conversations that we're having, millions of people have had the same conversation. But the idea is, after the conversation, what's going to do? So is this just going to be, again, yeah, these poor Black people, we won't let them live in these communities. Okay, cut, next interview. And again, that is the cycle that the Black diaspora has been trapped in within the United States.
Well, yeah, it's like seeing a movie that is it's like seeing I Am Not Your Negro and then going out for dinner or coffee and then it's over. But, so I was thinking about, critical race teaching, the debate. And I guess what I see it as, not only teaching about the history, but teaching about the present. And then I was thinking about, well, if people allow themselves to learn about this, they have to feel that they are part of it. And then I thought, well, the liberals who say, we want this, we are for critical race theory being taught. What about having to do something? I thought, well, if we're going to want our kids to learn, if we're going to want to learn, if we're going to want to read your books or the new Jim Crow, it's like, how do you read that and feel like you're not supposed to do something? And I feel, I get that, I hear it, I think I'm part of it. I'm increasingly uncomfortable being a part of the discussion, I have to say, because it renders me, starting to think, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to say, even? So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is what I've seen a little bit recently has been like kids the age of my grandchildren, 4, 5, 6, 7, are starting to get books with Black people in them. And so my thought is, well, wait a minute. how do young kids, like very young kids, who are smart, get taught about critical race theory or about oppression, not just having a black doll in a children's book. This kind of look. I loved Mr. Rogers. I just want to say, but this what's come after him in particular is a kind of cartoon in which everybody solves everything by saying hi, and there's a black teacher, or there's everybody. It's like there's a song for everything, and a little song which is kind of boring. But I keep thinking, well, why are we not teaching very young children stuff about this? What do you think?
And again, Carol, there's probably nuanced answers to that. The idea, again, being if you're surrounded by 400 years of this Eurocentric, oppressive environment, then you begin to look at Black people or racialized people as just objects, things that you can read about, things that you can talk about, things that you can cheer for, but you never see them as humans. So you're asking a new generation of people to erase that from their being, from their cultural DNA. And again, I think we have to sort of understand when we look at this Eurocentric perspective that America lives on, how do you get yourself out of that? For the Black diaspora, that would be decolonizing itself. And you have to sort of keep that in the back of your mind, that there are Black people within the diaspora that see themselves and other Black people as the enemy, because that is part of the colonization process. Carter G. Woodson wrote in 1933 in his epic book, The Miseducation of the Negro. And he talked about how the American education system is built, it's designed to continue to build on fabrications and the criminalization of Black people and their lives. And again, to sort of always shape them as property. So the education system in America, it's designed on that colonization quest. It's designed on it. So there's little or no hope for that. And again, it always goes back to the history of the country. People want to see the Black diaspora as less. Social institutions are created to maintain that status. And again, I think some of the things that you said, Carol, when you read about James Baldwin, see, James Baldwin, believe it or not, and this is the beauty of this, you think he's writing for you. He's not. And this is where people get their feelings hurt. You think you're reading James Baldwin because he's this classic novelist. James Baldwin was writing for me. He wasn't writing for you. So you see James Baldwin and the subjects that he's talking about, Black people, as these third dimension objects, like, wow, he really knows how to do this, when in fact, James Baldwin is directing his message of liberation towards the Black diaspora. That James Baldwin is saying, hey, we've studied you. We know who you are. And he's speaking to white America. We know who you are. You have no idea who we are. The issue becomes, do you really want to know who I am? or are you trapped in this fantasy of who you think I am? That's that's the bridge that James Baldwin really covers. But again, the idea behind it, a new generation. Carol, I have no idea whether a new generation would want to see the Black diaspora. And again, the Aboriginal people on the planet, the first human beings to walk this planet, look like me.
Yeah.
I have no idea whether 20 to 25% of the global population that is not Black would want to now see Black people as humans. And the beauty of it, Carol, I don't really care whether they do or not. I mean, see, and see, this is where I think sometimes, I mean, going back to James Baldwin wasn't sending this cryptic message that everyone's going to get along. James Baldwin understood clearly that the collision was going to take place, and the reality of that collision is how mankind moves forward.
Well, I want to say two things. One is that as I was listening to you, I thought, well, yeah, first of all, in order to write for white children about a Black experience, you can't just be a white person writing about that. You'd have to find out more. You'd have to find out more about who you are, and you'd have to not write in a colonial fashion, which is to have a couple of Black faces in your story and feel that that's about Blackness. I do care about liberals because I guess I am one. And when I saw I Am Not Your Negro, I don't know if I felt that was for me or for Black people. But when I saw James Baldwin's characterization of white culture, I felt ill. I don't know if my feelings were hurt, but I felt kind of ill and I felt envious. And that's, I really do feel part of the being hurt of the liberals in the time of Martin Luther King Jr. Part of being hurt when we were no longer wanted or seen as great partners, I think, was the envy because of what, in a way, James Baldwin shows in the movie, you know, the kind of dryness, sterility of white culture that, you know, in my conversation with Tim Wise, we talked about the price of whiteness. So I had, in my own tradition of being Jewish in the Ukraine or in Russia, or, you know, I had a lot of music. I loved Hebrew music. I couldn't stay religious because of all kinds of reasons, but I loved the music, and you know, but I don't have it anymore. And so if I were to go to Africa, and I met somebody at the conference of Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies who's in Kenya and has wanted me to go, I am sure I would feel the same envy. You know, the music, the dancing, the belonging that I don't have as a white person. And I don't have as a white person in an all-white community because I don't go to a church. And I'm not going to go to a synagogue just to belong. It just doesn't, you know, suit me. But could you tell me about what you think of Black Lives Matter and what you think of people having, you know, people I know and love having, you know, those things on the lawn? Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter.
Yeah, and you know, taking a step back very quickly, and just sort of remember, Carol, When James Baldwin published The Negro in American Culture, I think that was around 1961. And then he writes a report from occupied territory where he talks about policing. And I think that's around 1966. What James Baldwin does, and again, as a Black male, James Baldwin is trapped between Jim Crow and the Black Power movement. And this is where his words begin to resonate. And what he's trying to do, he's trying to tell a Black audience, hey, this is how we navigate this transition from Jim Crow to Black Power. And it's not going to be easy. And James Baldwin is providing these warnings. It's not going to be easy. There's probably going to be a lot of bloodshed that's going to take place, but there is going to be a transition, taking that to Black Lives Matter. And again, I think it's a nuanced conversation because Black Lives Matter, the movement, Black Lives Matter, the organization. So there's so many different entities of what we think of the phrase Black Lives Matter. Now, again, if we're talking about the organization has been under tremendous critical lens the last 4 or 5 years because of millions of dollars that are being raised and very little accountability of where that money is at. And those kind of movements are when they're fueled by money, where's the money coming from? Following the money isn't just something that a phrase that policing uses. Following the money usually leads to where the symbolism, the voice, the mantra, the ideology is placed. So again, Black Lives Matter is split into numerous factions. Where it's going to end up within the realms of Black liberation history, who knows? It doesn't look positive from an organizational standpoint, but from a movement standpoint, oh, I'm sure there are people involved in the Black Lives Matter movement whose core is just, the principles of Ma'at, that is truth, justice, balance, harmony, order, righteousness, and reciprocity. I am confident there are people that support the Black Lives Matter movement that are just. There's no doubt about that. But once big money and big corporations get involved in how things are going to be framed, then America begins to cycle its same pattern of we're going to talk a very good game, but at the end of the day, we're not going to lose our privilege so other people who are oppressed can be humanized.
Okay, again, I have two thoughts. I have, I hear you, and it makes, sense to me. For those of us who want to learn more at the risk of having to do more, you do a lot of work in prisons, and you talk about having people who are incarcerated move into being students. And I think in your coursework, you have some of the people you teach go into the prisons and become co-students. Am I right?
Yeah, and again, just to be clear, Carol, I've spent my entire academic career studying violence, both direct violence and structural or institutional violence, and that includes, I've done fellowships in Israel, I've done a Fulbright Hays in Africa, spending a significant amount of my time in Egypt. And so when you talk about prisons and prison education, again, you're speaking of institutions of carceral manifestations. There's no difference between placing somebody in a cage based on the construct of crime and the transatlantic slave movement. There is no difference, okay? But the idea is decolonizing. So I entered these spaces to decolonize. Incarcerated students fall under the same umbrella that Carter G. Woodson spoke of. That is, they're only as decolonized as the educational principles that are brought to them. So I've spent my entire academic career attempting to decolonize those spaces. So I just want to make sure we're clear on that. And specifically, one of the first educational programs within the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the BOP, and I expanded that to a state facility in Pennsylvania, focusing on juvenile lifers. So men who were sentenced to life as juveniles because of crimes they were convicted of, and currently are serving life sentences at this moment.
If someone like me asked you if I could visit, would that be offensive?
You mean visit a classroom?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess this is good or bad. The COVID-19 pandemic has placed an 18-month hold on those classes. Again, every institution is touched by COVID-19 now. Pre-COVID-19, or probably in the very near future, we're going to start college education classes again inside some of the carceral institutions. You tell me, Carol, why would you want to come in? Why would anyone want to walk into a carceral facility to see caged Black men? Why would anyone want to do that?
Well, my first answer is, aside from maybe I'm a masochist, I feel like I kind of need to learn and to deal with my fear of potentially being hated. But I find, okay, as a psychotherapist and as a social worker, I worked with some grueling situations, particularly when I was younger and still in the present. But I entered people's homes where there was a lot of violence, and everybody I've seen, so, like we diagnose schizophrenics, whatever. I just have found, I guess, I've worked some on the shadow. I found my own hatred sometimes. I was looking for my own goodness. So that was my journey. I was looking to be a good little girl. And I found, like, everybody I've worked with just provoked an eruption in myself, let's say, of feeling a connection that didn't involve feeling colonial. And, maybe I'm one of those people who, I mean, this is going to sound really a little cuckoo to you, I think. I've had, I worked with a Black clinician who was head of a community center. And after a number of years, he thought that maybe in another life I was a Black minister. That I guess maybe I'm one of those people who've never felt fully at home being white. So, or being, I've always felt like someone, like an outsider. I've lived in suburbia and not felt suburban. I don't know, so maybe I'm looking for some kind of honesty or some kind of connection or some kind of knowledge or some kind of getting off the colonial train. I mean, I don't want to be stupid about it. I wouldn't want to be physically attacked in a place. I'm kind of a scaredy cat when it comes to the
No, Carol,
physicality.
I think I understand what you're saying. Listen, we all know that race is a social construct. It is completely invented to subordinate someone who looks different. We know it's a construct, and yeah, it's fantastic that you want to get off the merry-go-round. That usually when the illusion ends and wisdom comes in, you want to be able to see life and people for who they are, all gimmicks aside. But having said that, a lot of people that I speak to, once they find out some of what I do inside carceral spaces, a lot of people like to visit. And I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with that mindset. But I always caution every single person. You could probably learn much, much more about the Black diaspora just walking into a Black neighborhood. Yeah, and I say that with all sincerity and humbleness, because once you walk inside a carceral institution, you're walking inside of a slave ship. So are you there to learn about the slaves or the slave ship? Because what you're seeing isn't reality. This is my point. So you're going to walk in and you're going to see primarily white staff telling Black and or Latinx men what to do. That's what you're going to see. You're going to see them in 100% control over somebody else's physical body. So even when you speak to someone inside, are they going to be able to give you a transparent, and this is the key, a transparent and authentic perspective on what's taking place? Well, no. If you speak to staff's going to tell you they did something wrong, they're being punished. And you're saying to yourself, they did something wrong, they're being punished. Okay, what does that even mean? If you speak to the person or people that they're talking about, they're going to look at you and go, hey, this is why I'm here. What answers do they provide? And don't get me wrong again. Carceral spaces, and I know I'm gonna break some mythology here. Carceral spaces, Carol, are some of the safest locations on the planet. Safest locations on the planet. Again, one of my programs is in a federal prison. Federal prisons are like Area 51. They don't allow visitors in that regard. But while teaching a class, could you come in while a class is being taught? Yeah, I would gladly allow you, or from my end, the facility, and you'll get it, for example, in a federal prison, they would request a background investigation on you. So they would do a background, they would make sure that you're clear to enter, and just think about this. Think about that process. And then as you go through the process, although I cannot provide specifics on it because some of that is confidential, you're going to go through a screening process on the inside. And I just want you to think about that for a second, Carol. Do you want to put yourself through a physical and mental screening process where it can be invasive? Are you going to put yourself through that so you can see what a carceral institution is like? And you may say, you know what? I have a better understanding of this process now that no, I'm not gonna put myself through that humiliation ever again in my life. Now I get it. So these men are here, they're held in cages, they have little or no rights. And again, I use the term slave ship because there were no rights on that slave ship. You couldn't leave when you wanted to leave. And many of them are incarcerated for constructs based on white supremacy. I've never met a person in my life, and maybe you have. I've never met a person in my life who was born to commit murder, who was born to sell drugs, who was born to sexually assault someone. I've never met that person in my life, but I have met people who, based on their social circumstances, that led them to behaviors that placed them in situations where carceral facilities were in their future because of societal constraints. So I've met many of those people, some people that I even grew up with. But again, long story short, it is a myth that somebody that comes in that visits a carceral facility is under harm. That's a myth. It is the safest location you're ever going to be at, probably safer than the home that you're living in right now. Safe, because they would never allow you inside if not a guarantee, but if they didn't take every single precaution to make sure that you were safe. And you know, like I said, I'm just curious. I'm just curious of what you think that you would learn. That
I don't know. I think
I can assure you that the data says there are about 2.3 million people incarcerated. Out of those 2.3 million people, approximately 40% of those 2.3 million people are Black men. We're not talking about Black women yet, just Black men. So I can assure you, when you go inside of a carceral facility, you're going to see a significant amount of incarcerated Black men. What you're going to learn from that, I have no, unless Carol, what you're saying is maybe you would like to volunteer in the long term to teach a class or 2 or 3 or 4. And then after 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of doing volunteer work, you would now say to yourself, wow, what a shame. Every incarcerated student that has come through a class that you're teaching is nothing short of brilliant. And you're saying to yourself, what kind of country do I live in where a person is incarcerated, shows a level of intellectual, cultural brilliance that you rarely see any place? What kind of society would have placed this person in circumstances that placed them in a cage? And that's where I think when you read my book and where it's critical of liberals, that you would say to yourself, wow, so I could have prevented this. I could have spoken up. I could have prevented this. I could have not saved, because we don't want to get into this idea where the white diaspora has to save somebody.
Yeah.
But we do want to get to the idea where you can choose humanity over your own privilege. Because at the end of the day, and again, this is quoting James Baldwin, people that you see in that carceral facility, you feel safe because they're there instead of a college class outside of that facility. See, that makes sense to a liberal. Oh, somebody commits a crime, put them in a cage. What doesn't make sense is because of their privilege, And it's a mythical privilege. It's a constructed privilege. It's not real. They rather have that mythical constructed privilege and feel safe and secure than to have that person who's in that cage free. And I don't mean just free physically, free in terms of liberation. That 400 years of oppression that placed them in that cage, if that were to go away, imagine what the United States would look like. Imagine what it would look like if it wasn't 400 years of oppression that placed people in cages. And again, I want to be extremely, extremely clear on this, Carol. Scholarly, the Lexile Committee in 1894, I believe, Du Bois, when he wrote the Philadelphia Negro in 1899, the Chicago Vice Commission, I believe, in 1911, the work by Henderson Donald in 1920, the Chicago Commission on Race Relations, I think in 1922, a lot of work that the Urban League did in the mid-20s, the Illinois Crime Survey in, I think, 1926, E. Franklin Frazier's work, The Negro Family in Chicago, and the Harlem Riot Report, I think that was in 1932 and 1935, and we can go on and on and on. There is a influx of data that supports what I'm trying to say. So these aren't just opinions that I'm sharing. There's an influx of data that supports that you place a human being within 4 centuries of oppression. And this isn't an invisible oppression. 4 centuries of institutionalized oppression. And please tell me, Carol, who's in charge of these institutions that are doing this? And see, this is the crust of this discussion. You're seeing the result, the effect. I'm asking you to look at and to take ownership of the cause. There's a cause and effect relationship, not just in science, but in the universe. What you put into the universe is what you get out of it. And everyone understands that. I'm asking you to take a look at the cause, not just the effect. Look at the cause, and you may find the cause. Go into a Black community, spend time in a Black community, spend time in a Black community, listening, and you're going to find the cause of why you'd want to go inside a carceral institution and then see caged Black people. It's an effect relationship.
Okay, so thank you. I wanna ask you something a little specific. First of all, I didn't want to just go into the institution. I wanted to go into one of your classes. I wanted to experience that. I wanted to experience some of what you teach and some of what you learn. So I didn't want to do a tourist attraction thing. But the other—
I got it. But just remember, Carol, what I teach at the University of Pittsburgh to a traditional University of Pittsburgh student is the exact thing that I teach to an incarcerated University of Pittsburgh student. So let's be clear. This isn't theater. You could walk into one of my classes right now and you're going to hear the same thing, the same books, the same scale of academic rigor that takes place with a traditional University of Pittsburgh class. Same thing takes place at a University of Pittsburgh class inside a carceral institution. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
No, that is clear. But are you implying that I could conceivably go into a Colorado prison with some training and teach something?
Listen, I'm not sure what the Colorado Department of Corrections, and that's the state facility, I'm not sure what their qualifications are. I'm not sure whether Colorado even has prison education programming. I have no idea, but what I am saying is this. is if that is something that you're interested in. The only thing that stops you from doing this is you. You can pick up the phone. You can call any facility, whether it's a jail, it could just be a county jail, and say, this is who I am, and this is what I would like to do. Is there anyone at the facility that I can talk to about this? And I think, based on 16 years of managing and creating my own prison education programming, I can guarantee you there is not too many carceral institutions that will turn you away. Because the idea is they understand the importance, and I want to be careful, they understand the importance of an education, but the issue is going to be what type of education. That is, Carol, are you going to go inside the facility and teach what the institution wants you to teach? And that's different than what you may want to say and do. And again, you may go at the end of the day. An institution in Colorado can say, okay, Carol, this is what you can say. This is what you can't say. This is what you can do. This is what you cannot do. And you may say to yourself, oh, I'm not going to do that. There it is. And then you're going to say to yourself, wow, now I understand the process. If I go inside this institution and my reality is to decolonize, oh no. Carceral institutions don't want decolonization. They want colonization. They want men and women to think as though they're inmates, that they're lower than them. Because it's very easy to, listen, it's easy to control an inmate because you can do anything you want to an inmate. You can't do anything you want to an incarcerated student, okay? It's a whole different level of not just physiological, but psychological realm. But the only limits you have, Carol, are you.
Okay, wow. So it feels anticlimactic, but I do want to ask you about Israel and Palestine.
Sure.
I feel like, you know, as a Jew, I mean, this is a kind of common theme. One is expected to have an opinion on Israel. I mean, has been expected in the past to be pro-Israel, actually. But I feel that there has been a movement within the progressive arena, like that, to be okay, you have to be pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli. And I know somewhat, and I've read somewhat, and I've looked somewhat, and I have some people telling me all kinds of different things. But I started to feel like, wait a minute, people want to boycott this country, that country, and who's boycotting the United States? So, like, I live here in a place that is pretty unjust, and I just wondered, just one day I started to wonder why all the focus there, and is it a distraction or is it really important? And I'd like to ask you what you think.
You know, I think it depends on the reality that you sort of want to see. You know, I spent time in Israel, and I would say that it is a region trapped in a cycle of violence. It's trapped. And we could surmise whether that is cultural, whether that is based on really any realities at all. I don't find a lot of people specifically that I speak to, or whether that's on an academic level or on a personal level, that have any animosity towards the state of Israel. None. I mean, because the bottom line is this: every single human being has a right for self-preservation and self-defense. and that includes the state of Israel. And I don't look at it as being on someone's side. I don't see life in that regard. I see it as an opportunity to liberate themselves. Boycotting, I'm not that person. And again, it's not saying that others shouldn't or should do it. I'm not that person. And I want to be specific. I did a study abroad in my doctoral program in Israel, where I studied at, one of the universities, Ben Gurion University. And I went back as a fellow a few years after that. I had a fantastic intellectual experience. And when I say intellectual experience, there was a tremendous level of transparency that no one hid anything. There was a level of open anger between people. You saw it every day that I woke up, and I spent some time as well on the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And I got to speak to and interview again, something that I've written on before. I had an opportunity to interview imprisoned suicide bombers, where they shared their perspectives. And I can assure you, Carol, that it is a people trapped in a cycle of violence that I don't know if there is a way out. I don't know if there's a way out of it. And I say that with a level of intellectual curiosity, but at the same time, intellectual reality, that sometimes things are just going to play themselves out, Carol. And I think that situation is going to play itself out. Having said that, it was a unique experience. During my time there, I was probably stopped by the IDF numerous times to ask me for my passport. And as soon as they saw that I had an American or United States passport, I was good to go. But it was an experience being stopped. It's no different than the United States when police stop Black males for stop and frisk. It was an eerie similarity. But again, and then to see occasionally if I was with somebody who was Palestinian, they would take them through a much more rigorous inspection. And again, that's what I mean about it being authentic and transparent. And then getting an opportunity to speak to IDF personnel and ask them, why would you do this? Why would you say this? And for them to provide an in-depth answer. And listen, look, when people are trapped in a cycle of violence, all they think about is self-preservation. And I mean self-preservation at all costs. And let's just flip that very quickly to the United States. We spent some time talking about the concept, because I don't think we're clear on what the concept of liberalism really means. But if we want to sort of flip that, I think plenty of people who would consider themselves liberal, there's no difference between someone who who perceives their identity, their political identity, as being liberal and or conservative, when people are trapped in a cycle of violence and self-preservation, that's the key. That means that your privilege and your self-importance is number one. And if somebody else is abused because of it, so be it. I saw that as well in the state of Israel. I saw that as well around the globe, that when a population believes that they're the privileged ones, there's nothing that they can do that humiliates themselves. All the humiliation is directed at the group that they think that they're afraid of. So that was clear in Israel as it is clear in the United States. It's that I'm the real person. Nobody else is the real person. I'm the real person. This is really my land. No different than the United States. This is my territory, so I can do whatever I want to protect myself and my territory. When people are trapped in that, then you know they're trapped in a cycle of humiliation. And I think you talked about it and you quoted something about humiliation and the cycle of shame and helplessness. Once you're trapped in that, Carol, it is nearly impossible to break your way out, because if you're trapped in that, imagine what the oppressed group is trapped in. They're in a cycle of self-defense because the onslaught hits them all the time. There is never breathing room. And James Baldwin talked about that. It's hard to hear somebody ask for help when you have your foot on their neck. When your foot's on someone's neck, you don't know what they're trying to say. The minute that you take your foot off their neck, I can assure you it's not going to be, I'm sorry. They're going to try to make sure that your foot never gets on their neck. Again, it's that cycle of violence. And I hope that answers your question. Again, I would go back and visit in a second Israel. Okay. But those were my realities. I think they saw me as somebody who was Jordanian. They saw me as someone who was Egyptian. They saw me as someone who was Moroccan. And at times they saw me as someone who was Israeli. It was amazing. You know, different locations that I went, people interpreted what I looked like. Some people embraced it. Others were like, he doesn't quite look like, but that's the reality of self-preservation. You look at yourself in the mirror. If somebody doesn't mimic what you think is right, you automatically assume it's got to be bad. You have to pick sides. Am I a good person or a bad person? But when you're trapped in a cycle of violence, you automatically assume the other is the bad person. And I think that other comes from who? You know, Edward Said, you know, when he talks about the other. I'm fortunate enough, Carol, I have been the other my entire existence. And it's weird when you're the Aboriginal person on the planet, but you're thought of under the construct as the other. It is a weird dialogue that we have.
Well, Tony, I cannot thank you enough. I feel kind of a little mesmerized, and that's not to put you on a pedestal. I've been dealing with the shadow a lot, which is when we don't see what's in ourselves, we project onto others, we demonize, we create the other, we hate them, we kill them, we don't show them on television, we show Ukrainians on television, and it's not to minimize the violence in Ukraine, but we didn't see that in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Yemen, in Africa. So,
Can I make one more quick point? Very quick. I don't want to minimize the fact that the violence isn't real. So let me make this crystal clear. When I was in the state of Israel, when I would get stopped, they really believed that my profile would do them harm. It wasn't imaginary. They really believed, based on a historical aspect, that my profile would do them harm. It wasn't imaginary. They really believed, and they were prepared to be violent in order to stop that level of violence. And that's sort of what I mean. And in the United States, it's real that people really think someone that looks like me is violent. And here's the reality. There is a level of perpetual violence. We can't ignore that. We cannot believe that the globe is trapped in this pathological pacifism. That's not reality. The example that you gave in Ukraine, it's not a video game. It really is a climate of tremendous violence. And we all know, Carol, having been a military veteran myself, the first thing that we lose in war is truth. That's the first thing that we lose. Because again, it's all about self-preservation. And when self-preservation becomes the mantra of the state, hey, the state has to preserve itself. This is when the violence goes from direct violence to structural violence. Hey, individually, I've got to protect myself, direct violence. Oh, no. But now I'm representing the state. If the state levels this, now there is no more truth. And I doubt very seriously, moving forward, that's why I say sometimes things have to play themselves out, okay? It's very difficult to get a level of truth during a time of war because you don't know what you're looking at now because everyone's in self-preservation mode. Everybody is in self-preservation mode. The states are, not just individually, but the state is in self-preservation mode.
Yeah, the states are, and the states give us a certain reality that we think we have to perpetuate.
Because you have to pick sides, right? You have to pick the good people and the bad people. And this is what I mean. And once you want to see past all that is what I mean. Once you sort of decolonize your thinking and you go, wow, in 6 months, in 2 months, there's probably, you won't even get a real body count in Ukraine. You're going to say to yourself, my goodness, tens of thousands of people were slaughtered and nothing changed. No, nothing changed. Zero. You know, just to flip this, Carol, what do you think the United States should do to stop what's taking place in Ukraine? Or is this about privilege again? And I mean privilege, the state. The state says, we're not going to do too much. We'll do a little bit because symbolically we should. But we're not gonna risk our self-preservation for the safety of others.
Well, okay. I'll say this, that I was Skyping, Zooming with people we know in the south of Italy, and they had a completely different point of view than what I was prepared to have or what I was being given. I feel what I was being given. They were talking about military exercises that NATO was doing in Ukraine in the fall of 2021, which I read about and was true. They talked about the impoverishment of the Soviet Union, impoverishment, but the lack of power, and that how NATO was formed to be a protective and defensive organization, but had become very much of a military organization, sending troops to the Middle East and moving into the vicinity of Russia. So I started to feel, well, you know, maybe I don't know all about this, you know, and I don't really mean, I instinctively am on the side of Ukraine, and I see the people suffering. And I like, this is like crazy, right? I like the fact that there's a Jewish president um, who has a name that's similar to my maiden name. So I kind of recognize him. But I also feel guilty about detaching myself a little from the absolute goodness of Ukraine. And because I'm seeing the people, you know, I'm seeing those people. So one of the things I've done a little bit of work on is military torture. And when I read about the people who are being tortured, I see them. And so, but I'm constantly seeing those people. So I'm going to say, I don't know. I'm beginning to feel like we are, if anything, as guilty as anyone else of putting the planet close to a nuclear war. And it's, it feels very crazy to me, and it feels dangerous, and it doesn't feel like we're supposed to be using nuclear weapons against Russia. It just doesn't feel that we're supposed to be doing that. So that's where I am right now.
No, and again, Carol, I appreciate it. I was just interested because, you know, as how that relates to the larger context of the conversation that we're having, that here we're having this conversation, and at the same time, a war is taking place in Europe where clearly politically and militarily a superpower is ramping up its violence because people are placing an emphasis on resistance. That the Ukrainian people are not going to give up. And at the end of the day, it's going to be very difficult for them to sustain.
Yeah.
But that, I'm telling you, at the end, I think everyone knows how this is going to end. This is what I mean that. And it's very difficult every day to watch on TV.
Yeah.
Suffering, that it's real. It's not a video game, that people are suffering. And when you have state power like the United States, and to continue to watch that suffering, at what point? And again, this is going back to what you surmise with James Baldwin. At what point are you contributing to this? When you sit back, listen,
Yes.
if you sit back and watch someone get oppressed, are you just as guilty as the oppressor? And at some point, I'm interested to see what level and shape that takes within the next few days, that as Russia begins to amp up its violence, at what point does the US go, wow, this just isn't a war on Ukraine. It's a direct message to us that we dare you. We double dare you to intervene in this. And when the US doesn't, how does that sort of play out as far as self-preservation is concerned?
Yeah. I feel like I don't know enough. And again, I'm watching people die. And I feel that during the Iraq War, let's just say Iraq, because for a second, I didn't see civilians suffering. I thought it was a very unjust war, but I feel like this country as a whole, again, was on the side of the just. And I don't know enough about Ukraine, but I feel like if I'm just seeing suffering of one people, like if I didn't see Iraqi faces, I didn't have to know that was going on. And so I feel like again, this is something that you might say, people are deciding what faces to show us. And so we're not in a position to see the humanity of other faces. So my friend in Italy thinks that we are making the Russian people suffer with these sanctions, and we're pushing them to idealize Putin. We're pushing them into a corner, and they see another point of view. And so I'm struggling with that. And at the same time, I see the faces of the people suffering, and I do want us to do. I don't want us to have a nuclear war, and maybe that's chicken whatever. But I look at the fact that maybe we've pushed Russia into a corner, and I want to look at that. And I feel that it's a very unpopular point of view, but I feel like
Carol, and again, these are dynamic times, and if you go back, if you go back into the 1960s, it now provides a framing of why so many people were against the Vietnam War. Because listen, the first time you get to see civilian casualties, listen, I'm just telling you, and every war has civilian casualties, but the first time you get to see them on TV, and part two, if the United States itself in history participates in oppressive actions against its own people, it's very difficult to justify and to be critical of other countries. And this is where I think the conversation begins to shift. If you're an oppressed population in the United States, do you feel the same way towards this conflict in Ukraine?
right.
No. If you're oppressed in the United States, you're looking at the US and you're going, you oppress people here.
Right.
How could you point the finger at Russia and tell them what they're going to do and what they're not going to do? See, I think that's where the conversation evolves. But I think in the 60s, because of the draft, people were forced to get into the conflict. Here, anytime you want to turn your TV off, Carol, you can.
Okay.
You couldn't.
I want to add something that James Baldwin also said in an essay from 1962, where he said a lot of people were so shocked that Germans could do what they did to Jews, but Black people were not as shocked because of what white people had done to Black people. And as I'm talking to you and as you're asking me, I think, what would happen if on television we showed what goes on in prisons, or we showed what goes on in Black communities, and we were forced to look at it and the violence of it. And we didn't it wasn't so far away, because I mean, in a sense, we collude in making it completely far away. I mean, when I say we, I say I. There are many of us that collude to make us feel that we don't have to contend with it. We have to contend with images of Ukraine, but not with images of Black people in America. So
but here's something more powerful though, Carol. The media and the state have been showing you images of what you think is Black America since modern television. But here's the problem. The overwhelming majority of people in the United States that find themselves under the umbrella of privilege don't care. Listen, Martin Luther King talked about this, that he felt that if you could shame your oppressor, if you could allow the so-called good people to see what was taking place within Black communities, there would be this massive uprising. And of course, we all know that MLK's letter to Birmingham, where MLK is critical of white moderates and liberals, and basically says, You're at fault. I don't blame the person in the South that hates Black people because that's their condition. But here you are in the North, you're obstructing this, you're obstructing liberation because you feel as though you're going to be placed in jeopardy. Your social status is going to be placed in jeopardy. The media has always shown America images of Black people getting arrested and Black violence in Black communities. But what they're not going to show you is how that occurred. And this is where you see the tug of war going on with critical race theory, that, that at the end of the day, there's a cause and effect relationship, that Derek Bell, again, said, hey, there's two premises to critical race theory. The first one is, of course, racism is a permanent component of the construct of America. Permanent, will never go away. Then part two, why? Because racism created the country that you see today. Without 1619, without enslaved Africans walking off ships that blossomed into 4 million enslaved Black people, without that occurring, what you see today does not exist. But again, this is Derek Bell with critical race theory. Nobody wants to face that reality, that this is permanent. The conversations that we're having will not change one thing under the premise of critical race theory. It cannot. Because in order for it to change, privilege would have to go away. The construct of white privilege has to go away. It won't. It will not. It cannot. That's what sustains the United States. And two, you can't change history.
Yeah.
Reimagine history. You can't renegotiate history. You can't take back 400 years. You can't do it. And we have these conversations all the time about reparations. How do you repair this? The United States doesn't want to pay reparations to Black people. No way. So how do you move forward? This is what I mean. How does dialogue move forward into action? Critical race theory says you liberate yourself. It's the fight. Even though racism is permanent, there's resistance. The Black radical tradition, there's resistance. And I think metaphysically, I think that's how the Black diaspora in America, some, and I'm just theorizing, they theorize the situation in Ukraine. They're going, good for you. No. Russia's bigger, they're stronger. At the end of this, Ukraine, you're probably going to lose. But along the way, you're going to change Russia. That is to say, the globe will never see Russia the same. No, we'll never see Russia the same. That the European Union, now everyone is going to get militarized. No. Everyone now is on notice that Russia can invade any part of Europe it wants. So now you're going to see a completely different outlook. And so, and again, this is just theoretical, that they look at the Black diaspora, looks at the Ukrainians and they go, yeah, that's a branch of critical race theory. What's happening to you is permanent, that it's never going to change, that in 100 years or 50 years, it's going to happen again. This is a reality because of the history. But it doesn't mean that you're to submit to it. It means that you're going to fight all the way. And because you're fighting, your children and your grandchildren are going to fight. And that in order for this to end, Russia has to colonize Ukraine. No matter what happens to the Black diaspora in the United States, the entire diaspora will never be colonized. There will always be resistance. And I think theoretically, that's how Ukraine is being perceived as, no, you're not going to give up. There's going to be resistance. In the end, will there be losses? Ukraine's not going to be the same. But the idea is, do you want liberation or do you want to be a zombie? And I think the Ukrainian people are speaking loud and clear that under no circumstances are we going to be zombies anymore. That's never going to be our lived experience. Our children will never have that lived experience. That's how you want to frame it, right?
Okay. Tony, I'm exhausted, but I want to talk to you forever. I think I probably could do that, but I'm going to let you go. I'm just going to say, Tony Gaskew, you know, you're already reaching the Black diaspora, and I don't blame you for not caring so much about white liberals or white anybody, but I do. And I so appreciate being here with you. And
it's not that I don't care about the individual people. I have an earthy love for everyone. But what I understand is that people are going to stand on their political ideology, and they're going to stand on their self-preservation. I don't have time to worry about somebody else's self-preservation in that regard. But I do have time to liberate and to work towards decolonizing the Black diaspora.
well, amen to that. And
it's been a pleasure. Be safe. Chris, thank you very much for everything that you're doing as well.
Okay, hope to talk to you again.
Sounds good. I know.